Colleagues. If you're joining us from clinical medicine, neurophysiology, or biogerontology, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating explainer. We're going to systematically break down the latest data on immunological architecture. We spend so much time looking at the surface symptoms of aging, right? Well, today, we're going past that. We're mapping out the exact cellular and systemic mechanisms that literally drive biological decline. So let's get into it. To anchor where we're headed, I want you to consider this cultural touchstone from Alexander Pushkin. Invisible, bending, and growing cold, we move toward our beginning. It's powerful, isn't it? I mean, long before we had the tools to sequence T-cell receptors or, measure cytokine cascades, there was this innate understanding that aging is this invisible, creeping inevitability. But today, we aren't looking at this as a poetic tragedy. No, we're framing it as a strict immunological construct. We are moving toward our beginning because, our immune ontology curve absolutely dictates it. Okay, here's our structural roadmap for today's review. 1. We'll look at the legacy dogma collapse. 2. The false homeostasis trap. 3. Twin cellular pathology. 4. Monotherapy dangers. And finally, number 5, the plateau window. All right, section 1, legacy dogma collapse. Let's update the science. Okay, let's dive right into this by deconstructing what, let's be honest, many of us were explicitly taught in medical school. Looking at this direct comparison, it creates instant cognitive dissonance, doesn't it? We were taught that thymic involution begins at puberty, basically to shift energetic resources to reproduction. But emerging science, it proves it actually begins at year 1 of life. It's a strict evolutionary mandate. We were also taught that a rebounding lymphocyte count post-infection equals clinical recovery. Well, modern data throws a massive red flag there, warning us that this is often false homeostasis. It's actually masking a highly dangerous expansion of autoaggressive clones. Plus, cancer and autoimmunity, they aren't totally disparate diseases like we used to think. They're twin pillars of the exact same mechanism. And finally, those reactive monotherapies we typically deploy at age 65, completely scientifically obsolete compared to rational, proactive combinatorial therapeutics deployed around age 40. So to really understand why this happens, we have to look at the thymic pacemaker. Thymic involution is not some random biological defect. It's a hardwired, programmed biological clock. The medullary thymic epithelial cells, or TEECs, act as the primary pacemakers here. Now, at peak export, the thymus is pumping out 2 to 3 million naive T cells every single day. That's a massive output. But as TEEC's function genetically declines, that senescent export drops to below 1 million. The kicker here is that the thymus never truly switches off. It just drastically throttles its output. And that fundamentally starves the periphery of those crucial naive polyclonal receptors over the span of decades. And making matters even worse, something called the remigration paradox. So normal migration obviously seeds the immune system, but as the periphery ages and gets, disordered, mature cells and Tregs pathologically remigrate back to the thymus. This excessive remigration actively suppresses new naive genesis. It's a vicious, self-perpetuating negative feedback loop. Basically, the greater the remigration, the faster the onset of immunosenescence. It just accelerates the whole decline. Moving on to section 2, the false homeostasis trap, a true clinical illusion. We have a really stern clinical warning here. The term false homeostasis was actually coined by French immunologists back during the 1980s HIV epidemic, and let me tell you, it is absolutely crucial for us today. When a patient experiences lymphopenia, whether that's from severe stress, a viral infection, or just aging, the body frantically races to refill that void. And as clinicians, we see a normalized lymphocyte count on a standard blood panel and we celebrate, right? We think, great, they're recovering. But that quantitative recovery is frequently a complete illusion. Because underneath those normal numbers, it's masking a catastrophic qualitative shift. We're looking at a massive expansion of CD8 memory cells rather than the actual restoration of those vital CD4 naive T cells. Let's walk through the exact microcellular pathology of this homeostatic proliferation. Step 1 is the void. This is where naive T cells undergo apoptosis. Step 2 is the fill. The immune system hits the panic button and urgently attempts to restore total cellular volume. Step 3, and here's the flaw. Instead of generating fresh, new naive cells from the thymus, the system forcefully clones the surviving peripheral cells, which brings us to step 4, the result. You are left with a severely contracted immune repertoire, entirely dominated by memory cells and clones that are, quite frankly, highly predisposed to attack host tissue. Which brings us to section 3,
Twin cellular pathology. Let's look at the systemic consequences.
Now, what's really fascinating about this, and maybe a bit terrifying, is how this perfectly unifies our understanding of age-related disease. We're looking at the twin pillars of senescent pathology. Oncology and autoimmunity are fundamentally linked downstream. I mean, when the immune repertoire becomes severely contracted, the overarching systemic consequences are just profound. These two paths, they share a single shared root cause, the decreased migration of naive T cells from the thymus. Let's contrast the cellular failures of these two pillars. On the oncology side, the severe contraction of the polyclonal receptor repertoire essentially means our T lymphocytes lose their diverse recognition capabilities. So thousands of microtumors that naturally exist in healthy tissue, they simply fly under the radar. They're no longer detected, leading to unchecked expansion. Then, on the flip side, the autoimmunity side, that false homeostasis we talked about causes this aggressive expansion of surviving peripheral clones. This leads to a huge accumulation of cells that are hyperreactive to self-antigens, causing widespread tissue damage. It's a dual failure, but it all originates from the exact same immunological deficit. All right, Section 4, monotherapy dangers. The problem with isolated interventions. Understanding this dual pathology absolutely forces us to challenge our current protocols, especially some of the really popular medical and biohacking interventions out there right now. This brilliantly illustrates why isolated interventions in a heavily compromised network are basically doomed to fail. We see two distinct paths here: checkpoint inhibitors and severe fasting. Both of these attempts to manipulate an aging immune system through single, isolated targets, and both essentially guarantee a catastrophic off-target collapse. Why? Because they completely ignore the underlying architectural degradation of the repertoire. Let's actually look at the mechanisms here. Checkpoint inhibitors artificially suppress Tregs to unleash anti-tumor activity. Sounds great in theory, right? But because the underlying repertoire is already autoaggressive due to false homeostasis, this intervention frequently triggers fatal autoimmune storms. On the other hand, we have severe fasting or heavy caloric restriction, which is hugely popular right now. But this initiates a massive stress hormone cascade that induces acute lymphopenia. The mathematical verdict here is crystal clear. Any non-targeted stressor that kills lymphocytes will force the system to rebuild through homeostatic proliferation. And the result? You're going to rebuild the system with a significantly higher ratio of highly dangerous autoaggressive clones. No way around it. So, where does that leave us? Section 5, the plateau window. Let's talk about combinatorial medicine. If monotherapies are mathematically insufficient and, frankly, often dangerous, how on earth do we intervene? Well, we have to move toward rational systems engineering. So the crucial point here is timing. Current gerontological medicine usually attempts these desperate salvage operations at age 70+, which, let's face it, yields incredibly marginal results. The rational model dictates that we must deploy systems-level interventions during the therapeutic window, specifically the plateau phase, right between ages 40 and 45. We literally have to artificially extend the duration of this biological plateau before thymic involution and false homeostasis become entirely irreversible. A massive cornerstone of this intervention is targeted cytokine therapeutics, specifically interleukin-7 and interleukin-15. Naturally, endogenous levels of these cytokines just plummet with age, but they're incredibly unique. They selectively stimulate the proliferation of normal, naive T cells rather than those dangerous memory clones. The clinical vision here is actually profound. IL-7 and IL-15 should ideally be deployed as routinely as aspirin immediately following any severe viral infection. We need to do this to fundamentally block the onset of false homeostasis and forcefully direct the immune proliferation toward naive T-cell dominance. But cytokines alone just aren't going to cut it. Complex immunosenescence requires multimodal additive engineering, the whole shebang. So we have three pillars of combinatorial systems medicine. First up, cytokine support, to heavily drive that naive proliferation we just talked about. Second, targeted monoclonal antibodies, which need to be precisely calibrated to suppress the specific inflammatory cascades driving thymic degradation. And third, dendritic cell therapy, administered sequentially to meticulously present antigens to our newly refreshed naive repertoire, guaranteeing high-fidelity immune responses. Let's move to and see how this all builds into our ultimate roadmap. To achieve true, robust, healthy longevity, we absolutely must abandon single-target drug paradigms forever. Pillar 1 is preserving the thymic pacemaker by aggressively supporting TEC function and blocking that peripheral remigration. Pillar 2 is suppressing false homeostasis. We have to stop treating normalized lymphocyte counts as clinical victories and start routinely deploying targeted cytokines. And finally, Pillar 3 is executing all of this through additive, combinatorial clinical engineering. To fully grasp why this is so critically urgent right now, we just have to look at our immediate post-pandemic reality. Think about it. Nearly 100% of severe SARS and COVID-19 cases featured profound acute lymphopenia. And, as we've established today, every single instance of viral lymphopenia virtually guarantees a subsequent wave of homeostatic proliferation. We are already seeing the accelerated emergence of dozens of distinct autoimmune syndromes and totally novel oncology cases, and they are being directly driven by this post-COVID immune repertoire corruption. Which leaves us with this unavoidable, frankly chilling question. Is modern medicine actually prepared for the inevitable 10 to 15-year wave of autoaggressive and oncological pathologies driven by this massive population-wide false homeostasis event? The underlying architecture tells us it is absolutely coming. The hard data urges us to abandon isolated, outdated treatments and finally embrace complex immune engineering. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, let's keep challenging the dogmas.
Thank you for being with us. Mega Psi is for you and for us.